So good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. We are expecting a number of people to join us still, but we want to keep to our time as best as we can. First of all, a warm welcome to all of you, to our Mind and Life Europe Association members and our Mind and Life Europe friends. Thank you for joining us today, this afternoon, for this webinar. My name is Cornelius Pietzner, and I serve as Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe. We're pleased, of course, that you've chosen to join us and to become a Mind and Life Europe friend and participate in the webinar this afternoon. In the next weeks and months, we have a number of interesting webinars and webcasts planned exclusively for our Mind and Life Europe friends. And we hope that you will take a look at what we have planned for you by reviewing our website, where we have all the events listed, all the upcoming events listed. This is now our fifth webinar, I think, for our Mind and Life Europe friends. And as already mentioned, throughout the fall, we have a number of more that are already scheduled. Before describing the format for this afternoon's webinar, let me warmly invite you to join Mind and Life Europe in a special dialogue conversation with His Holiness the Dalai Lama on September 17th at 5:30 in the morning. Central European time. And this special webinar and conversation focuses on the theme of grounding knowledge in uncertainty, which was also the theme that we took for our Summer Research Institute recently in August. It will also focus on the idea of, in this time of uncertainty where many people act more individualistically and even nations act more nationalistically, how can we find and act upon our sense of our common humanity? So please feel warmly welcomed either at 5:30 in the morning on September 17th, or you can look at this at your convenience at some other time. It'll be in the digital archives of the Dalai Lama's website and on our website. We will also live stream it from our website. The dialogue will be conducted by Amy Cohen, Mathieu Ricard, and Andreas Ripstorff from our side, obviously in conversation with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, in regard to our webinar for this afternoon, as usual, our featured speaker will present for 30 minutes, and after that we'll proceed to your questions and responses, and we'll conclude the seminar or the webinar just around 18:30 this evening. Please feel welcomed and encouraged to use the chat function on your screen to type your questions at any time to the speaker, or even general questions, and I'll try to sort them out to the best of my ability during the Q&A time. We'll also be listing an email where you can list general questions that are not specifically addressed to our speaker for this evening. The topic of this evening's webinar is the subtle mind, essence and interdependence. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Diego Hangartner as our presenter. Diego has completed his studies in pharmacology at the ETH Zurich, Switzerland, specializing in psychopharmacology and addiction. His main interest is to understand what constitutes a healthy mind and how to cultivate it. He lived for 11 years in Dharamsala, India, learned Tibetan, and studied for 7 years at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. Diego has a long history with Mind and Life Institute and Mind and Life Europe. He was Mind and Life's Chief Operating Officer from 2009 to 2012 in the USA. And in 2008, he co-founded with others Mind and Life Europe and was its director until 2014. Diego founded the Institute of Mental Balance and Universal Ethics to develop and provide tools and programs that foster mental balance. He created and teaches the Wheel of Mental Balance, which is a methodology to cultivate a healthy and resilient mind. So we're very pleased to welcome Diego Hangartner as our presenter for this webinar. Diego, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Cornelius. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation on the topic that is probably a little bit beyond confines. And I will be drawing today heavily on my, let's say, first 11 years in Dharamsala studying Buddhist dialectics, and then, of course, continuously developing and getting more and more into the practice, as well as just expounding on that. And so with no further ado, I'd like to just start sharing my screen and guide you through this process of understanding what is actually the mind and how is it understood in the Buddhist context. And so obviously, one thing that I really was particularly fascinated in the context of Buddhist philosophical training is how it is that we define things. Foremost, obviously, how is the mind defined in Buddhism? I will then engage in a sort of exploration about the different categories of mental experience, which then will lead me to a deeper understanding and particularly also a contextualization of the mind being in the context of interdependence. And then I will come up with some conclusions. And for some, this might be really pushing the boundaries, but it is very much based on a thorough investigation of really how phenomena are. So when we come to the definition of mind, and when I was sort of exploring what kind of methods are there to explore reality, of course, in the West, we have one methodology, but when I discovered that Buddhism has also a very thorough and exceedingly methodological way of exploring it, which is super logic, I found this very convincing. Let's begin, for example, how do we define water? Now, of course, what is your definition of water? You will probably say, yeah, well, water is H2O. Well, if you say that water is H2O, you have already a metaphysical decision made without being conscious of it, because you assume that water is merely a physical object. However, in Buddhism, water is not defined on the basis of physicality, but actually that which is wet and moistures. That's the definition of water. Now, same question, what is fire then? We define fire as a chemical process that actually transforms a burning matter, for instance, carbon, in combination with oxygen to become fire and therefore do a combustion process. Well, that's only half of the truth, but actually fire is that which is hot and burns. Now, what is the difference? The difference here is that we are not looking at the world just as a mere materialistic point, from a materialistic point of view, where we have atoms that do interact with each other, but actually we look at it from an experience, quality, and function versus the essence of an object. Now, when we start thinking about the essence of an object, obviously from the Buddhist perspective, all phenomena essentially are empty of inherent existence. It's just a coming together of different phenomena that together create a new one. But the experience is sort of left out when you just look at physical objects. Whereas in the context of a Buddhist perspective, it's always an experience, quality, and function. Now, when we apply that to the mind, obviously, one definition that we can use is that which knows and is conscious. It's not a physical object, it's really a process. It's something that is able to know and is conscious, or is aware, or cognizes. And it's clearly, we all know that somehow it is a different nature than a physical object, which in itself already lends to a complete different perspective how we approach or should think of what is consciousness. So consciousness, we can use many different words to describe it. It's either conscious experience. We can also say it's conscious of, which in that sense, we need to also use semantics here a bit, because we actually use language to describe something. It's a transitive idea. Or he is conscious, which is therefore intransitive. Awareness is to be aware of. Again, it's transitive, whereas just to be aware is intransitive. Also, we apply, of course, the ideas of self-consciousness and self-awareness, which are, again, something else, which is reflective. Excuse me, I'm just going to close the window here. Now, what do we mean by actually transitive and intransitive? I'll explain that further. Mind, therefore, can be described as mental events, like a memory, or an idea and a hope and expectation. But also there is a whole dimension around an objective dimension, which is the mental. Transitive here means related to an object and requires one or more objects. I can see an object, therefore the experience is related to be conscious of, for instance. But when we say intransitive, does not really require an object, which is therefore intransitive, like you are conscious. And when we apply the next level of analysis, we need to come to terms with what is reality. And the Buddhist dialectics explains reality in 4 different principles. One is the principle of interdependence. Another one is the principle of function. The third one is the principle of nature. And therefore also the fourth one is the principle of evidence. That all in application to reality. And this is how His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been talking about it in The Universe in a Single Atom, which is a book that he published in about 2002. And then also Tukjimpa, his personal English translator, has been explaining it in Drepung in 2013 during the Mind and Life conference. So what can we say? One way of exploring reality and the mind is by asking, what is it? But that has its limitations, because if we say what is it, we somehow subliminally assume that it is an object that can be explained with physical attributes. And that has many different assumptions also in the background. However, maybe a better question to ask is, what does it do? What does actually the mind do? And for consciousness and mind, it is obvious. It is a direct experience. This is particularly important as it always requires for consciousness to be present in order to what we would define and identify as reality, as well as consciousness itself. So there is no obvious reality out there that is independent by the way we perceive this reality. And that has been clearly articulated in quantum mechanics, when the slit experiment clearly says that the observer actually has an influence on how reality is being perceived. And that, again, applies also for consciousness itself. So increasingly subtler definitions have emerged in the process of sutras and tantras. And so I'll be showcasing a few definitions here that increasingly are subtler in its nature. In the sutra context, which are the texts that have been early in the development of Buddhism, is said that which apprehends an object. That is what is consciousness, or let's say mind. And I'll come to more detail what is mind and what is consciousness. At the moment, I use it on purpose, quite interchangeably. Sutra has then been started to be interpreted, and Dharmakirti, who is the logician par excellence in the context of the later development of Buddhism in India, and sort of a founding father of logic, is Dharmakirti defines it as being clear and cognizing. That's the mind. If we go a little bit even more subtle, more detailed, Then in Tantra, which are sort of a even later development of Buddhism, they say that that which experiences clarity and is knowing corresponds to the mind. So here again, we see that it's actually the experience is in the foreground. And what does it experience? It experiences clarity and is knowing. And then sort of the peak of the subtlety exploration of the mind, or subtle exploration of the mind, is they basically say, Mahamudra Dzogchen says, there is only awareness. There's nothing else that is really there. And apart from lucid awareness, there is simply nothing, according to Longchenpa, a very prolific writer in the 13th century in Tibet, and considered one of the greatest scholars, certainly in the Nyingma tradition, the early translations. So that leads me to the next level, where we see that there are different categories of mental experience. So when we talk about consciousness, there are three core dimensions of consciousness. One is the subjectivity, is the capacity that you are now able to basically experience that you're sitting on a chair, or you're watching at the screen, or you're trying to listen to this. And then there is also an intentionality, is, well, why are you here listening to this? Why is it that you get up in the morning or you want to explore all these different questions? So there's another quality, not just the subjective experience, but also an intentionality. And then there is a level of reflexivity, where you really are able to explore the thinking process of yourself, or the information that you have received, and try to make sense out of that. And therefore, feelings are experienced through the same mental states that apprehend external objects. They are not experienced separately from the objects we see, although they are different from them. So when we see an object, a photo, for instance, of somebody that we know, obviously, immediately a feeling comes up, and it is the apprehension of that external object that triggers in us a sensation and a mental state, for instance, recollection. And so therefore, we cannot say that it is separately from the objects we see. And objects here can also be memories, although obviously they are different from them. So how the big conundrum is, how can a single mental state be able to apprehend an external object and experience a sensation? This is true, possible because it's a dual nature of the mental states. This is as rephrased by George Dreyfus, also a Western scholar of Dharmakirti's, particularly of Dharmakirti's logic. So when we talk about consciousness, mind, and intellect, we need to differentiate here. Consciousness, Nambasheba in Tibetan, is a mental state that arises on the basis of form, sound, etc. It's actually cognition of aspects. This type of Nambasheba, they arise when we see something, when we hear something, when we smell something, and obviously also when we have a recollection. However, where does consciousness therefore take place? And that's where the mind comes in, or sem in Tibetan. And this is the first vivid cognition of the general aspect of the object. Now, when you're barely getting up in the morning, for example, and you're just a little bit dizzy, not quite clear where you are, mind is already present, but you do not have an imprint or a sensation or perception of, for instance, that you are in bed and you are in a place that you are familiar with, or it's a place that you are not familiar with. So that's actually the first vivid cognition, any single moment of our perception. And then we have mental factors, sengjung, and that settles in afterwards, and that discerns the features of the object with, oh, I like this, I don't like this, or is it something that I know or I don't know? And therefore that is called the intellect, or yi. And this is taken from Longchenpa's Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind, a new translation that just came out 2 years ago. So when we talk about consciousness, mind, and intellect, well, what do the sastras or the comments of the Bodhisattva Bhumi Sastra, which is a comment on the Bodhisattva's levels of the Bodhisattvas, there is a description. This is sort of taken more from the early Buddhist, and sorry, no, this is more from the later canon of commentaries. The perceived appearance of an object is consciousness. Like the sounds that you just hear right now, that's consciousness. But the first detecting cognition of it is mind. So there's obviously something happening behind before you really sense a sound, for instance. There is a first detecting cognition. And then the mental factor of the subsequent discernment of the particular features of this object is what we call the intellect. The capacity to differentiate, oh, I know that makes sense, or it's not making any sense, and I don't quite know what it means. So these three states actually interpenetrate and are concomitant with each other. They do not appear singularly, but they're certainly very much different on the basis of their essence or nature. So when we talk about the aggregates, and here we go again into a little bit more of a deeper context of what Buddhism has to say about form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These are called the five skandhas, or the five aggregates. And so consciousness is that which individually cognizes the object identity of all phenomena. This is all taken from MIPAM, the Gateway of Knowledge. And so roughly we can say that there is 1 to 6 are 6 collections from visual to mental cognition. The fact that you are now hearing or seeing obviously belongs to the more rough or coarse consciousness. But the fact that you also can think and observe that you are thinking, that would be a mental cognition. But Buddhism doesn't end at this point. And I think that's where it really becomes very rich, when we start looking at what's actually happening underneath. And that's what is called the all-ground consciousness. This is the basis for cognitive acts, and without bias, it is merely cognizant and conscious. That's sort of like the basis from which all these mental processes can emerge. And obviously, behind that, there is Rigpa, which is awareness. Could be translated as awareness, but there are many words to describe that. But let's use, just for brevity's sake, awareness and Rigpa in a similar context. So in Dzogchen, which is sort of one of the practices that really goes at the core of it, mind can be investigated from 3 aspects. It's the essence, the nature, and the capacity of manifestation. Ngowo, Rangshin, and Turje. The essence is, what is it? It's empty. There is nothing that we can find that has a substantial entity that is independent, that is self-sufficient, and that is permanent. That's the emptiness of it. However, what is therefore its nature? The nature is of purity and clarity. A mind that is purified and is resting in itself is pure and clear. And what kind of forms of manifestation does it have? It can manifest, therefore, as compassionate energy. So mind, obviously, and brain are very interdependent. And this is something that I remember clearly when His Holiness Dalai Lama asked the scientists in a Mind and Life conference very early on, I think it was in the early 90s, when he asked them, when a perfect ovum meets a perfect sperm in a perfect womb, will consciousness automatically occur? Now that would be the material causes and conditions for consciousness to automatically occur, because we have a perfect ovum, we have a perfect sperm in a perfect womb. And so this question he put forward to the scientists there. And the scientists answered that it will not be sufficient and it will not automatically occur. But they were unable to explain why. Buddhist explanation here would be that an additional factor is missing, which is the presence of consciousness. So you need to have consciousness of itself to be present, so that consciousness can occur within a perfectly ovum meeting a perfect sperm in a perfect womb. So there is something else, obviously, from the Buddhist perspective that needs to be present, and science was not able to explain what is missing. That brings me actually to the next topic, which is this interdependence. And Dignaga, who is other of the Nalanda tradition writers in India in the 4th century, he was explaining that there are two types of causes. One is a direct cause, and others were indirect cause. Sometimes this is translated as primary cause and secondary causes, or causes and conditions. So let's just stick with direct causes and indirect causes. A direct cause is, for instance, the fire that produces smoke. When we see smoke, there is clearly, we can deduct that there must be something that causes it, and in the past that was fire. That was the primary cause. But then there are indirect causes, which is obviously the fire needs to have something that it can use to burn on, which is the firewood. So we have substantial causes or primary causes and cooperative conditions. So a substantial cause of consciousness must be of the same nature as consciousness itself. So that primary cause needs to be of the same nature as consciousness. It cannot be another factor. And matter, for that purpose, provides the cooperative conditions, like sense organs, a brain, a nervous system, but matter itself cannot be the substantial cause of consciousness because it's of a different nature. So each moment of consciousness is therefore preceded by an earlier moment of consciousness. This is how it is explained. That a conscious moment, the preceding moment of consciousness, is a conscious moment. Therefore, consciousness has no beginning and no end. Consciousness has no beginning and no end in its subtle form. Of course, the coarse cooperative conditions, the sense organs, the brain, the nervous system, that just falls apart at death and has created who we are by growing in a womb. And this comes from Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika. So the doctrine of dependent arising, Pratityasamutpada, is a key doctrine in the Buddhist concept, also of how to explain reality as well as consciousness and the mind. And here we go, and I'm going to go a bit quicker. People who are interested in that can obviously read much more about the 12 interdependence links. And these are the 12 interdependent links, but of particular interest in this discussion are these two, the third link and the fourth link, which are consciousness and name, which then lead to 6 senses, the contact, the feeling, the craving, the clinging, the becoming, the birth, and then of course old age and death, and the whole cyclic of existence, but also of every single moment of our conscious experience is basically driven. And at the source, at the beginning of all of that, is ignorance. Now, the 12 interdependent links were taught to look at the conditioned genesis of dukkha. And it was not just kind of like a fun thing to do, but it was really the exploration of what actually causes suffering, frustration, dissatisfaction, or the term dukkha basically stands for all these. What is it that leads to this? And when we look at it, it becomes clear that there is a conditionality that lies at the core of this understanding. So all these conditioning factors occur in one single mind moment. And the Samutya Agama specifies that by saying, and this is now from the Chinese canon, Agamas is the collected canon of in the Chinese context, because there is this, that is. Because this arises, that arises. This is the interdependence. There is nothing that arises without its conditions and fundamental causes, even for consciousness. With the removal of ignorance, the remaining 11 links also come to an end. If we don't cause ignorance to fester and proliferate, then that will lead to a cessation of this 12 interdependent links. And the Mahanidana Sutra traces dependent arising back from old age and death via birth to the conditional dependence of name and form on consciousness. And so here we go, name and form conditions consciousness, but consciousness also conditions name and form. And what do we mean by consciousness in this context? It's actually the mind's ability to be conscious of something. Form, however, is the material side of experience. There is obviously a glass there, or a camera, or an object that I can see or hear. That's the material side of experience. If I don't have any sound that makes noise right now, I probably will not experience it. But then what happens in the mind, as a function of the mind, is that we create a feeling, a perception, an intention, a contact, or attention, and then we create a name or we label it. And so this reciprocal conditioning of consciousness and name and form is the basic matrix of experience. It is a continuous interplay between the two. And so according to early Buddhist analysis, this builds the world of experience. So there is consciousness as the foundation, the primary cause, which in interaction with name and form is creating the experience that we are subjectively going through. So therefore, subjective experience is a process that is devoid of a permanent entity. It is a changing stream of consciousness that depends on a changing process of name and form. And name and form also obviously influences the stream of consciousness. So they are codependent, they're interdependent. And so in earlier Buddhism, consciousness is a continuously changing process of being conscious. That's the foundation. But what type of experiences we see, if it's a warm weather or it's cold weather, if it's something pleasant that we're looking at or something unpleasant, that obviously doesn't really matter to the fundamental quality of being conscious. Later traditions, however, go further and envision consciousness as a staccato-like series of micro moments of being conscious. And each micro moment passing away immediately has the potential for a new moment to come into existence. And so therefore, of using the noun consciousness, which could give the misleading impression of that there is something permanent, inherent, independent, one might just speak of being conscious, conveying actually the sense of a process. So Buddhists would advocate to say consciousness as an object is actually a problematic way of looking at how the experience is happening. So therefore, being conscious would rather convey the sense of a process. And this is also said in the Dhyana Sutta, which is again from the Agamas. The Buddha said, Ananda, independence on consciousness, there is name and form. What is the meaning of this? And he asks here, if consciousness or being conscious did not end at the wombs of the mother, would there be name and form? And Ananda replied, no. And then the Buddha goes on and said, but if consciousness would depart from the womb, would name and form come to grow? Well, of course not. There is no process that would allow for name and form to come into existence. So therefore, Ananda said, no. So in view of interdependence, this is much more complex, and it's not a simple body-mind duality. We need to be clear here that I'm not talking here about mind being something completely independent of a bodily experience. It's codependent. Because for name and form to grow, consciousness is the necessary condition. Conversely, what happens at death? When the body will disintegrate and loses its vitality and heat, then obviously consciousness or being conscious will also depart. And this is not limited to physical form. It's actually a transition into consciousness. And that can manifest as different realms. In the Buddhist cosmology, we talk about desire realm, formless realm, without actually physical or material obstruction, but it's still being conscious. And just last weekend, I was teaching a retreat on the Bardo, which is the realm in between. It's a transition, is an explanation on what actually happens to consciousness and the conscious experience when the body disintegrates. It's a particularly fascinating text from the Tibetan tradition. And so what happens to proficient meditators? Proficient meditators actually create a mind-made body. And this is in quotes, because it's obviously not a physical body, but it's a quality of the mind that has almost like a bodily experience, like in a dream. When we're experiencing a dream, we feel like we have a body, but sometimes it certainly not corresponds to the body that is lying in bed and sleeping. So this being conscious includes the tendencies that are considered to be present. And that's where the intention comes in. It is understood that consciousness at the time of conception is not a tabula rasa, it's not nothing, but rather carries imprints from past life. And that comes into this alaya, the kunshi, or the foundation of all. And so this reciprocal conditioning of consciousness and name and form at the time implies that this continuity of memory is in itself a changing and conditioned process. It's not something fixed or permanent, but it's also dependent on what we do, for example, in this life, and what are the effects towards tomorrow, as well as what follows. So the example that is often used is a river flowing into a lake and then flows out of the lake. And what happens to the water while the dirt settles in the depth of the lake? It's clear that it's the same water, but it's different entity. The lake has actually changed the water, but it's still the water. It's not different, but it's not the same. And so let me come to my conclusions for today. It is clear that mind is not an object. It is actually an unfolding experience. And therefore, it is helpful to think in terms of function. What does it do, rather than a thing, when we ask, what is it? And as we saw, and the Buddhist scholars, as well as yogis and practitioners and adherents to the tradition, have been exploring that for the last 2,500 years. There are different levels of the mind, and also depending on exploratory method and subtlety of what we could call the clarity and the mental stability, fundamentally, of the actual experience. And when we talk about consciousness, mind, and intellect, they are clearly contextual and situational. It's not definitive. And the subjective experience forms actually the basis of consciousness. And when we talk about phenomenology, this is where it really centers around. It's the basis of our consciousness, which in turn is the foundation of the subjective experience. And this subjective experience is very much based on interdependence, not just independently from anything else. And so the question therefore remains, what conditions do we create for exactly a stable mind, but also a clear mind to unfold? And that's where our universal responsibility comes in, to create environments where stable minds can flourish and clear minds can flourish. Thank you very much for your kind attention.